Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion, the commentary arm of Bloomberg News. This is our weekly politics live stream. And of course, today we are going to talk about Venezuela, Maduro's extradition from Venezuela to the United States to face drug trafficking charges, the White House's plan to, quote, run Venezuela, and all of the myriad knockoff effects of this major and pivotal moment in U.S. Latin American relations and global spheres of influence. I'm joined today by two columnists who've been all over this topic for us. Andreas Kluth, who covers national security and diplomacy for us from Washington, and J.P. Spinetto, who covers all sorts of Latin American affairs from Mexico City. To get into this conversation, I think the easiest thing to do for all of you is to tee up a brief clip from Donald Trump's press conference on Saturday, in which he talked about his administration's goal in Venezuela. Let's have a listen.
We're going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. So we don't want to be involved with having somebody else get in, and we have the same situation that we had for the last long period of years. So we are going to run the country.
So our reminder to our audience that in 2016, Donald Trump campaigned as a critic of U.S. occupations of foreign territories, specifically Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's until recently been pretty clear about that. We now have an epic sea change around those lines, and we're going to have to extract all the different elements of this to try to give you a better understanding of how to think about this. So, Andreas, let's start with you. What do you think, when it boils down to the bare bones of it, was the White House's goal for sending a military force into Venezuela and extracting its sovereign leader, Maduro?
The goal, I think, was a very instinctual, raw power, pure might makes right, imperialist instinct to recently announced and under the label of the Monroe Doctrine, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. This hemisphere is ours, the way presumably Asia is China's, Europe is Russia's, and we do whatever we want. This guy was bothering us. Recently, he mocked us by dancing on stages when we've been bullying him already. We had to snatch and grab him. International law be damned, congressional approval be damned, everything be damned. We're going to go in and we're going to get the oil. And yeah, we talked a good game in the past few months about this being about drugs. It's not really about that. We're going to coerce them into giving us the oil we want.
So you see it as primarily about oil and not about suppressing drug trafficking or stabilizing a decaying state led by an authoritarian ruler who has engaged in human rights abuses.
Well, the drug thing was a pretext all along, and it's interesting if you watch, for example, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and all the talk shows the day after, trying to twist themselves into pretzel shapes they've essentially dropped that because, Venezuela is not any player in the fentanyl trade, which is the main problem in the US, and a marginal player in the cocaine trade, and marginal, and furthermore, only providing Europe rather than the American market. So that wasn't gonna, it's the pretext, it's the fig leaf, as it were. The other part, regime change, this is very interesting. This has only really become clear. JP will have more to say about this. In recent days, you noticed in that original press conference from which you just showed the clip, he threw, we wanted that safe, he called it a safe and judicious transition. Well, normally the US would do something like that and work on a transition to the democratically elected, the opposition, Well, he threw that opposition completely under the bus. The leader of that, not the elected president, but the leader of that was Machado, who, of course, won a Nobel Prize that Trump, coveted. So she committed that original
Right.
sin. But he threw her completely under the bus, saying she's a nice woman, but she has no respect. She won, her bloc won 70% of the.
Well, let's slow down a little and unpack
Yeah.
some of this, because we're putting a lot on the table right
Yeah,
now.
we are.
I'm reminded when Trump is talking about running Venezuela of the U.S. experience in Iraq.
Right.
And there were a series of different sort of occupation leaders. Some of it was being directed by Rumsfeld's team in Washington. There were military leaders on the ground in Iraq. And then there were people who had civilians who had a diplomatic and managerial role, like Paul Bremer, who
Right.
famously was in Iraq in a blue blazer and army boots. And the goal in that occupation was completely rebuilding Iraq in a westernized, market-dominated guise. They were going to have banks and checking accounts. The oil was going to be pulled up out of the ground, through revivification of Iraq's oil infrastructure. Nothing that grand is being proposed for Venezuela in terms of a total reordering of the society, but certainly the administration is talking about a long-term commitment to rebuilding and revivifying Venezuela's oil infrastructure, which could be anywhere from a 5 to 10-year project. Trump mentioned yesterday it may be done in 18 months. He doesn't have a lot of experience, obviously, in oil extraction himself. He may have people telling him that, but that's a wildly optimistic take on what running the country and getting its arms around, and the U.S. getting its arms around Iraq's or Venezuela's oil infrastructure amounts to. So what do you think is on their mind specifically, Andreas, when they talk about running the country? Or was that Trump, as he is wont to do, just throwing something out at a press conference without a lot of premeditation?
I believe the latter is the case because, again, Marco Rubio was behind him, and as he's been practicing a lot lately, kept a stoic face, but that's probably the first time he heard of that. The day after, he was twisting him into these weird word contortions, saying, well, no, people are now fixated on this running thing. And what he tried to say is, no, we're not going to run the place. We're going to coerce Venezuela with this quarantine that we're going to maintain into basically giving us what we want. So Rubio talked a completely different game, which was not about we're running, we're governing, we're administering. It was more like we're coercing them, and they better do what we want. Rodriguez and the existing regime. That's what I was trying to say. There's no regime change. There's just the decapitation of the leader. And that's Rubio's definition for the time being of the verb to run. So that is a completely different. And as you said, Iraq was about essentially a failed attempt. It was a failed attempt to bring Iraq into the modern and democratic and liberal world. This is nothing of the sort. This is just an oil racket, in which, as you said, the American oil companies aren't even enthusiastic about.
JP, I suspect for residents of the entire constellation of countries in Mexico, Central America, South America that surround Venezuela, a large number of which were concerned and threatened by Maduro's corruption, Maduro's human rights abuses, Maduro's authoritarianism, that this comes as sort of a double-edged thing. And at some level, it's a lot of relief, probably. At another level, it does invoke these ghosts of the Colossus of the North reinserting itself in regional affairs. And I'd love to hear you explain how you think the region's responding to all of this.
Yes, I mean, from a human perspective, I think Saturday has been a great relief, great happiness, great joy to the Venezuelans, especially the Venezuelan diaspora, that has been abroad for many years, right? Let's remember that more than 8 million Venezuelans have left the country. That's unheard of in modern history, if you want, without a conflict or a war between two countries. And you saw the celebrations around the world in Buenos Aires, in Madrid, in all these places, because Maduro has been essentially a dictator, an authoritarian, someone who used, as Chavez did, the secret police to punish, torture, and murder his political opponents. So you hear all these incredible human stories about Venezuelans losing their family connections, their wealth, their lives under Maduro. And Saturday obviously was a special day because that guy finally is going to face some justice, even if you can argue about what are the actual cases against him. Now, as a Venezuelan friend told me, that happiness lasted until the moment they saw that Delcy Rodriguez and Diosdado Cabello were still running the show. So this opens all these questions about what is going to be the system actually running the country in the next few months.
Well, so how would the region view a long-term occupation of Venezuela by the U.S.? You know, along with all the lessons history has taught us, from the Romans to Napoleon to the British to the French and to the U.S. in recent decades, how difficult and often cataclysmic occupying another country is for any country.
Well,
how much patience will the region have for both the substance and duration of a U.S. presence in Venezuela?
so it's very interesting because the reaction from the regional government split according to their ideological positions, right? So we saw, for instance, Brazil and Mexico, the two largest economies in Latin America, joining Chile, Spain, Cuba, arguing that international law has been broken and that they are very concerned about this. We saw Trump's allies in the region, especially Javier Milei in Argentina and Daniel Noboa in Ecuador, supporting the measure. I think in any case, whatever is the approach of the government, this is a massive failure for the region because this conflict has been on for years, decades. And I would have loved to see a regional solution to this. We shouldn't have to wait until Uncle Sam comes in and removes Maduro.
What
The
would that
region still
regional
has,
solution have been, JP, specifically?
well, you know, there has been several attempts, many instances where there was dialogue and tried to find a solution, but we always have found that some countries were complicit of the Chavista regime. And for ideological reasons or even financial reasons, they prefer to have Maduro than trying to find a solution. I'm not saying here that solving Venezuela was easy, but I think more could have been done, especially by Brazil. Brazil is the biggest loser of all this. Brazil now has a neighboring country with the largest oil reserves in the world, effectively run by the White House. And Brazil is supposed to be the leader of Latin America. That's their aspiration. And they were out of this. So I think beyond the point of seeing this historic moment, because this is without any doubt one of the biggest historic moments of US Latin America relations, and we're gonna be writing and reading about this for decades to come. For Brazil, this is a disaster because it shows it has no leadership, and in the end, Trump acted, the US acted to
Would you say
solve
the
a
same
problem.
of Mexico? That Mexico also failed to step up in this moment
Yes.
as well? Mexico would obviously argue with the idea that Brazil is a regional leader. There's a long and rich competition between both countries for the mantle of being Latin America's premier country. But would you also put that at the feet of Mexico as well?
Yes, in a way, yes. I think what we saw, especially with the Lopez Obrador, since Lopez Obrador arrived in 2018, is clear complicity with the Maduro regime. When Maduro steals the election in 2024, that it was a clear violation of all written and unwritten rules in the region, right? And still, there was no consensus in the OAS to sanction or to take measures against Maduro and the regime, because the leftist governments, Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, they prefer to try to find a solution. You could argue if they ever were interested in having a solution, or they were more comfortable having an ideological ally, even if that meant destabilizing the region. Because regardless,
And
again,
looking away from all sorts of corruption and abuses.
yes, and plus the migration effect, because all these countries received millions of Venezuelans, led to tensions. We saw these recently in the Chile election, right? Chile has been a country that received many thousands and thousands of Venezuelans, and that led to now the campaign by the right-wing candidate Jose Antonio Cast arguing that they need to leave. So the the lack of a regional solution to this problem, and again, I'm not saying that it was easy to solve, but they could have taken more. They could have taken more, strongest decisions a decade ago, has led to destabilization of the rest of the region. No question about that.
So just to put a bow on this before, because I want to pick up with Andreas on what this means for international law and respect for sovereign nations more broadly. But I just want to get back to this idea of how much patience is the region, what does the region want to see in the next chapters of this action, where they will be patient about a long-term U.S. presence in Venezuela, if a long-term U.S. presence in Venezuela is needed to see through the changes that the Trump White House says it wants to see?
So what I would love to see from the regional governments is trying to get involved and trying to restrain Trump and the U.S. From its act in Venezuela. There are ways where the Latin American governments can collaborate, for instance, in humanitarian aid, trying to help with the economic recovery, trying to help with the oil boom, if you want, to the oil industry recovery. But there is a more realistic problem here now, especially for Brazil. If this is a success for Trump and the US, maybe that's a problem for Brazil. Brazil's policymakers may now be thinking it's better that Trump fails in Venezuela so the Americans don't try this again in the region. So that puts the incentives for the regional countries, especially for the leftists, on a different path from the goals of the U.S. administrations, and also of, from the goals of all those that want to see a free and democratic Venezuela. So I think this element adds another layer of difficulty to solving the Venezuelan problem. Not only now they may be complicit or playing dumb, but also they may be actively trying to root for the U.S. to fail here to avoid a future intervention in the region again.
Andreas, as JP pointed out, regional leaders were willing to look the other way around what is a clear violation of international law. Those laws are hard to enforce anywhere. They're UN inspired, the International Court of Justice inspired, as our colleague Noah Feldman noted this morning. However, the fact that they are hard to enforce doesn't mean they have moral and legal standing and weight. And Trump has essentially run roughshod over the idea that you shouldn't remove a sovereign leader from a sovereign state anywhere in the world. And what do you think the ramifications of that are globally? What's the global echo of this beyond Venezuela?
Absolutely huge, absolutely global. As you just summarized it, the international law is hard to enforce, but for 80 years it has partially and sometimes hypocritically been enforced mainly by the United States. This system of norms built on the United Nations and all the associated institutions was American built. So this is a huge inflection point, and we'll be, as JP said, we'll be talking about this for years all over the world, because Trump has always shown disdain for international law, for the United Nations and its charter in particular, but this is the most egregious, most blatant break and violation of all those norms. Article 2 of the United Nations Charter, using force against a sovereign country, and all the other things, including nabbing or trying to indict extrajudicially a head of state. It is illegal from A to Z. Now, in that way, it is parallel to another case, which is Vladimir Putin's attempt to do exactly that in Ukraine to Zelensky in 2022. The difference is Zelensky was legitimate and democratically elected. Maduro was not. But from the perpetrator's point of view, Putin and Trump, they're in a similar role. Putin was also telling a story he had made up that this regime in Kiev was criminal. He called it Nazi and had to be removed. He was hoping to do a snatch and grab, or maybe
and that in fact Ukraine had historically always been part of Greater Russia and should be reintegrated into the Russian polity.
The Russian world, exactly as you're hearing now in recent days from members of the Trump administration, especially Stephen Miller, that the Western Hemisphere is exactly that. That's the Don Roma doctrine, plays exactly that role for America. So by completely breaking or abrogating international law and the United Nations regime, 80 years old, and saying this is the new rules of the game, that's the change. And of course, Russia and China, which have been quasi-allies of Venezuela, which is very interesting, they're looking at this and they're not even sure they don't like it.
Well, and zero in on China there, Andreas. And obviously, a flashpoint in Southeast Asia and the South China Sea has been Taiwan, and whether or not China has designs on bringing Taiwan into the fold. Is this an invitation to China to do just that?
It gives them, I would say, carte blanche, because the U.S. can never again morally, legally get up in the United Nations Security Council, which met yesterday, and say, oh, you, China, you just nabbed and grabbed someone from Taipei, or you seized a shoal in the South China Sea. This is wrong under international law. We cannot say that anymore after what we've just done. So in that way, now, on the other hand, within China, you get they're split too, because some Chinese people are saying, wait a second, maybe our guy, Xi Jinping, is the equivalent of Maduro, a dictator bound to fall. But of course, from the regimes, from Zhongnanhai's point of view in Beijing, is like, oh, okay, I guess that argument that they'll bring against us in the Security Council, that is now gone. They do that over there. Putin does it in Europe. We can now do that in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait.
JP, one of the kind of glaring comparisons in this has been the fate of Honduras's former president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who had been successfully prosecuted in the U.S. For a number of crimes, including demonstrably provable drug trafficking, with the kind of evidence that seems lacking thus far in the Maduro case, at least around drug trafficking. Is the region willing to sort of ignore the fact that Trump is using the idea that this is essentially an action supporting a domestic law enforcement prosecution of Maduro and not a military invasion, while on the other hand, he undermined a domestic prosecution of a proven criminal and ultimately pardoned him? so the philosophic inconsistencies are glaring. The political and policy inconsistencies are also glaring. Does that matter in the region?
I think obviously it does. I mean, what is perceived is the lack of a clear idea of why this is happening, right? Especially after the press conference. I think uh, what I was saying was there was the initial euphoria about Maduro finally paying for his crimes, but the moment that Trump says we're going to run this country, that is a sign and a message to the rest saying maybe I'm next. And I know the Venezuela case is very specific, but Trump also has threatened the Colombian president. He has said that the Mexican president is not in charge and the narcos are running the country. So
Cuba's been invoked as well.
yeah, Cuba has been invoked. I think Cuba is a
Really?
special case again because Cuba is falling apart by itself. And I think the administration, what we can see now is that it's taking the right approach, which is not touch Cuba because Cuba is going to fall by its own weight and by its own problems. But Mexico is different, right? The president is essentially saying the country is being run by the narcos. We want to act. We're going to take action in military terms against these narcos in Mexico. That's something that Mexico will never allow, of course. And at the same time, we have this massive USMCA renegotiation this year, the year of the World Cup. So we have these two, these similar situations where on one side we have Trump threatening Mexico, on the other they need to get an agreement and also host a World Cup, pretending that they are part of the Tres Amigos agreement, right? So I think for the region, the main concern, even for those that may be allies of Trump, is who's next and why. Because if the cases aren't clear, then maybe you don't need to be a narco or a dictator to suffer the same fate of Maduro. I think at the same time, Venezuela is special because it touches on every obsession of Donald Trump. It's the narcos, it's the migration, it's the oil. So, and it's the strongman, right? It's Maduro, it's the Chinese getting involved there, the Russians and Cuba. So, if you read the national security strategy and the Monroe Doctrine revival and this idea of the Trump color, if they want to put that in action, this is the best example and the best way. So I wouldn't find the reasons of why Trump did this in comparison to what he did in Honduras and all of that. I think the reasons are in what is written in that document. They want to project power in the region, and to do that, Venezuela is the best example of the best case they can make.
Andreas, JP hinted at, and JP, you can correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but that the region welcomes Maduro's removal, but a long-term occupation, there may be less patience for that. Is that accurate, JP, in terms of your?
I think the leftist governments, they don't like even Maduro having gone, right? Lula and Sheinbaum and
But
Gustavo Petro
specifically in
Colombia.
terms of the duration of the U.S.'s presence there.
Yes,
That
for
a
sure.
light touch is what the region would prefer.
Yes, nobody will cry over Maduro, but they will cry about the fact that the U.S. have removed a president of a South American nation, which is something that never happened.
So, Andreas, how does that idea land with this particular White House? You know, we noted earlier, as you noted, Rubio sort of shifting uncomfortably behind Trump during the press conference. It was hard to discern how central a role Hegseth played in any of this. It seems that Tulsi Gabbard was excluded. There's been talk of Stephen Miller, who has absolutely no regional experience or managerial experience, being the designated person from the administration who may or may not, quote unquote, run Venezuela. How do you see this landing in this White House? Is there a uniform view among that leadership team about what to do next? And are they thinking in precise and exacting ways about what's best for both the U.S.'s own regional hegemonic aspirations and what's also best for Latin America?
No, there is not a unified view. In fact, I think this is the outcome of the opposite of some factionalism. You mentioned almost the whole cast of foreign policy people there. Tulsi Gabbard has excluded herself and has been excluded because she has been for years talking against specifically the Venezuelan case and exactly this sort of intervention everywhere. So she is probably very uncomfortable in her space. Hegseth, Daniel and Kane, they're playing warrior. They're playing warrior. They're not. So people like Vance, I would think, are very uncomfortable because they're traditional isolationists. A lot of MAGA people do not want these forever wars. Some do because Trump just did it and Trump is their guy. And then you get to people like Rubio and Stephen Miller. Stephen Miller is sort of, to me, the id of this administration. As you said, he has no formal role. In fact, the person who has a formal role is Rick Grenell, special envoy to Venezuela. He's completely absent. Okay, he tried to negotiate for a year. He's gone. No, but Stephen Miller and his wife, by the way, who really has no role, they're all over X, formerly Twitter, and the media and the cable news, saying things like Greenland is next. So not just, as JP said, Colombia, Cuba, the whole list of the Latin American, but the entire hemisphere. And he said, basically, Greenland is ours, should be ours. And, what right does Denmark have to say? So it has sort of freed the id. And there's a lot of not just testosterone, but I think this military, because militarily it was spectacular and masterful, as was Iran. So there's a risk of hubris now. It's like, look, they think they can do anything. We haven't even gotten started. And they may carry on. And I think they see themselves as new age American imperialists. And that is the danger for some in the White House.
Especially when hubris
others are very uncomfortable.
Managerial chaos. When it's not just hubris alone, but the team doesn't have a consistent philosophy and may not work well together.
And Rubio is the one who intellectually probably understands what we're talking about right now, the danger of that, but of his position of trying not only not to get fired, but to thrive. And in terms of his career, he is thriving and probably to run again. He is in this awkward position. How do you articulate in an intellectual way this chaos in terms of strategy? There is no strategy. There are these trends. Whereas someone like Steve Miller just goes in front of the camera and says, yeah, the whole hemisphere, it's ours now. We're going to keep going. That's where we're at. And Trump, I think, just has not devoted a minute of his life to thinking strategically about this, but just saw this is a great way for me, for 3 news cycles, 4, maybe 5, to look really tough.
I wish we had another half an hour because we've run out of time. So we're going to have to put an end to this conversation today. I'm sure we're going to be coming back to this topic very soon. This is going to, I think, echo for years in the region and elsewhere. Andreas Kluth and JP Spinetto, thanks for joining today. You are both columnists for Bloomberg Opinion. I'm Tim O'Brien. I'm the senior executive editor of Bloomberg Opinion. Thank you for joining us for our politics live stream.